Nobody knew why the stranger stopped in the corridor that night. The boy was crying. The man knelt down, said something nobody else could hear, and walked away. 10 years later, the boy would hear that voice again. It was 1997. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and fear. 7-year-old Daniel sat on a plastic chair outside the ICU, his sneakers swinging above the floor. His mother was inside. The doctors had used words he didn't understand. Words like critical and complications, and a careful promise they would do everything they could. His father had gone to make phone calls. Daniel was alone. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The sound drilled into his skull. He pressed his palms against his eyes, trying not to cry. He'd been told to be brave, but brave felt impossible when the hallway was too quiet and the lights buzzed too loud and his mother might not wake up. His chest hurt. Not the kind of hurt from falling off his bike. A different kind. The kind that made it hard to breathe. His mother had taught him to count backwards from 10 when he got scared, but he kept losing track, starting over at 8, then 6, then 8 again. Then he heard footsteps. Soft, deliberate. Someone walking slowly like they had all the time in the world. Daniel looked up. A man stood a few feet away. He wore a dark jacket and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. His face was partly shadowed, but his eyes, dark, gentle, impossibly kind, were fixed on Daniel. The man didn't say anything at first. He just looked at him, not with pity, not with curiosity, just seeing him. Then he knelt down. Daniel's breath caught. The fluorescent lights seemed dimmer suddenly, like someone had turned the volume down on the world. The man's presence felt like stepping into a quieter room. The man spoke. His voice was barely a whisper, but every word landed clear. He would never recall the exact wording, only the meaning, which stayed with him. He told Daniel that his mother would be okay, that sometimes the hardest nights were just before the light came back, that he should hold on no matter what, because people who love you never really leave. And then he said something Daniel would carry for the rest of his life. He said if Daniel ever needed help, really needed it, he should remember this moment, remember that someone had seen him and that he wasn't alone. The man's hand rested briefly on Daniel's shoulder, warm, steady, real. Daniel blinked. His throat was tight. He wanted to ask who the man was, why he'd stopped, how he knew. But before he could speak, the man stood, touched the brim of his hat, and walked away. His footsteps faded down the corridor. Daniel turned to watch him go, but the hallway was empty, like he'd never been there at all. A nurse passed by moments later, chart in hand. Daniel caught her sleeve. He asked whether she had seen a man with a hat. She paused, said someone had visited the children's ward earlier that evening, someone important, though she couldn't say who. Visiting hours were long over, but security never asked him to leave. She'd heard he'd been walking those corridors for hours, stopping wherever he heard someone crying. Then she smiled and kept walking. When Daniel's father came back 5 minutes later, Daniel tried to explain, but his father was distracted, still on the phone with insurance companies and relatives. He nodded absently and said it was probably just a visitor passing through. Daniel's mother survived. She came home 3 weeks later, pale and tired, but alive. The hospital radio had played the same songs on loop during those weeks. Daniel still remembered one. Something about healing the world. He never knew why, but every time he heard it, he felt less alone. Like someone was watching over them. Life went on. Daniel grew up. The memory faded into something hazy, like a dream he wasn't sure had been real. But the boy never forgot the man's eyes. Years passed. Daniel graduated high school, started college, fell in love with music, spent his nights writing songs he'd never play for anyone. His mother's health had stabilized after the surgery, but the damage hadn't disappeared. It had only quieted. Daniel was 17 when his mother's pain returned. The doctors said surgery. The insurance said no. One night in 2007, staring at a deadline he couldn't meet, his phone rang. He'd see his mother wince when she bent down, pause at the top of the stairs, hand pressed to her side, catching her breath. She never complained, but Daniel knew. So did his father. The hospital said it would cost $30,000. Daniel's family had already drained their savings years ago. There was nothing left. The room was dark except for the blue glow of the screen. Outside, rain tapped against the window, steady, relentless. Daniel closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he thought about that night in the hospital. The man who'd knelt down, the voice that had promised he wasn't alone. He wondered if that had been real, or just something his 7-year-old brain had invented to cope. And then the phone rang. It was an unknown number. Daniel almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. A voice came through the line. Quiet, warm, strangely familiar. The voice asked if this was Daniel, asked if he remembered a night 10 years ago in a hospital corridor when a man had stopped to talk to him. Daniel's heart stopped. He did remember. He'd never forgotten. The voice said, "Your father wrote me a letter once. I never forgot." Daniel tried to ask who he was, but his voice wouldn't work. The man didn't explain how he'd found him. He just said Daniel's father had written a letter once, years ago, to a foundation, asking for help. The letter never got answered, or so they thought. He said he'd heard about Daniel's mother, that he wanted to help, that some promises were meant to be kept, even if they took years to come back around. His hands gripped the phone so hard his knuckles went white. The man told him to check his email. Then the line went quiet. Daniel's hands shook as he opened his inbox. There it was, a message from a private account. No name. The subject line simply said it was for his mother. Inside was a receipt. Payment confirmation. $30,000. Paid in full. Sent directly to the hospital. The surgery was scheduled for the following week. Daniel stared at the screen, his vision blurring. He tried to call the number back. It was disconnected. He tried to trace the email. It led nowhere. But at the bottom of the message, there was a 2-word note urging him to stay strong. Daniel sat there for an hour, staring at that note. Rain drummed against the window. His chest felt tight and loose at the same time, like something inside him had cracked open. He didn't tell his parents. Not yet. He wasn't sure how to explain it. Wasn't sure they'd believe him. But the next morning, his father got a call from the hospital. The bill had been paid. The surgery was confirmed. They wanted to know who'd made the payment, but there was no name attached. Just a reference number that led to a private fund. His father stood in the kitchen, phone pressed to his ear, eyes wide. His mother sat at the table, hands folded, tears streaming down her face. Daniel watched from the doorway. He didn't say a word. If this moved you, like and subscribe, what would you have done? Daniel's mother had the surgery. It went perfectly. She recovered faster than anyone expected. Within months, she was back to herself, laughing, cooking, arguing with his father about TV shows. The pain that had shadowed her for years finally lifted. Daniel never told her about the phone call. He wasn't sure she'd believe him, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. He started researching, not obsessively, just looking. He searched for stories about anonymous donors, hospital bills paid by strangers, acts of kindness that left no trace, and he kept finding the same thread. A quiet fund, no publicity, no press releases, just families who'd been saved when they'd run out of options. And then Daniel found a photograph, a concert from 1997, the same year, the same month. Michael Jackson had been in their city, performing 2 nights at the arena, staying at a hotel 2 blocks from the hospital. Daniel's chest tightened. He zoomed in on the photo, the hat, the jacket, the way he stood, hands in pockets, head slightly bowed, like he was listening to something no one else could hear. It was him. What he found in that photograph stopped his heart. Daniel sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. His hands were trembling. He'd spent 10 years wondering if that moment had been real, wondering if the voice on the phone had been some elaborate dream. But there it was. Proof. The man who'd knelt in a hospital corridor in 1997 had been Michael Jackson, the king of pop, the man the whole world knew, and he'd stopped for a 7-year-old boy nobody else had noticed. Daniel didn't try to confirm it publicly. He didn't reach out to journalists or post about it online. Some things weren't meant to be dissected. Some kindness was too quiet to be shouted about. But he started living differently. He finished his degree in music education, started teaching kids who couldn't afford lessons. He'd meet them at community centers, in church basements, anywhere they could find a piano. He never asked for payment. One afternoon, he paid for a stranger's groceries when he saw them counting coins at the register. Another time, he stopped at a park and sat with a boy who looked lost, just talked to him until his mother arrived. He thought about that night in the hospital often, about how a man who didn't know him had stopped, had seen him, had remembered. And years later, when Daniel's own son was born, he made a promise. If he ever saw someone alone, scared, carrying a weight too heavy, he'd stop. He'd kneel down. He'd say the things that needed to be said. He never learned how Michael found him. He didn't know how a man with a schedule that never stopped had time to remember one crying child in a hospital hallway. Didn't know how, 10 years later, that same man had tracked him down when his family needed help again. But Daniel understood something deeper. Some people don't just pass through your life. They leave a mark, a voice, a memory, a promise that echoes long after they're gone. Daniel never heard the voice again, but he didn't need to. He'd learned the lesson. Kindness doesn't need to announce itself. It just shows up. It kneels down. It remembers. And sometimes it calls you 10 years later to remind you that you were never alone. The boy grew into a man who kept promises, who noticed people others walked past, who believed that the smallest gesture could change everything. Because one night, when he was 7 years old and terrified, someone had stopped, and that someone had been Michael Jackson.